KL Publications presents Call Me by Ryan C. Sanders, an urban story of serendipity. It was a Friday night, and Chris found himself in the club for what felt like the third time that month. He wasn't much of a club goer anymore, but tonight was different. Tonight, something in the air felt charged. The music thumped in sync with the rhythm of his heartbeat, and the energy around him buzzed with a kind of restless excitement. He had come here with a few friends, more out of obligation than desire. But as the hours passed, he felt himself easing into the flow of the night. He was leaning against the bar, his eyes scanning the crowd aimlessly, when he first saw her, Latasha. She stood out from the throng, shoes off, lost in the music, swaying to the rhythm with her bare feet on the dance floor. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was in her own world, moving like the music had unlocked something deep inside her. Chris' friend leaned in, noticing the way Chris was looking at her. "She's been dancing like that for a while," his friend remarked. "You should go dance with her." Before Chris could muster the courage, Latasha glanced his way. It was only for a second, but the way her eyes met his felt like the universe was pulling them together. Without a word, she moved toward him, her steps slowly and deliberate. His heart raced as she got closer. She leaned in and spoke to his friend, her voice soft but confident. "Can I dance with him?" His friend, grinning, nodded, and before Chris knew it, Latasha was in front of him. "Let's dance," she said, her voice carrying a challenge and an invitation all at once. Chris hesitated for a moment, but as soon as he took her hand and they moved toward the dance floor, everything clicked into place. It wasn't just a dance, it felt like an orchestration of something much bigger, like this was meant to happen. Her body moved against his like they had danced there their whole lives. An instant, an undeniable connection. As they danced, time seemed to slow down, and the world faded away. Chris felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic, as if her very presence commanded attention, but not in the way that most people did. She was radiant, real, raw. There was no pretense, no facade. Chris leaned in close. As his voice low, he spoke, "It feels like I've known you forever." Latasha smiled, her eyes flashing with something he couldn't quite place it. "Maybe you have," she teased, spinning gracefully in his arms, letting the music carry them. That night, as they danced, it wasn't just attraction, it was recognition. It felt as though, in that moment, Chris's heart was the Ark of Noah, ready to take her in, to weather any storm that might come. He hadn't believed in love at first sight since he was a kid, but here he was, caught in the whirlwind of something that felt inexplicably right. He had a partner at home, but tonight, that didn't matter. For the first time in years, it felt like he had found the person his soul had been picturing all along. After the club, Chris couldn't stop thinking about Latasha. He tried to push his thoughts aside. He was married after all, but something about their connection lingered, haunting in his mind. Days turned into weeks, and he finally couldn't resist the urge any longer. He called her, but Latasha didn't answer. Weeks passed before he heard from her. Latasha had been keeping her distance, knowing that Chris was unavailable, yet unable to shake the memory of their dance. When she finally called him back, the connection was instant. They spoke for hours, their conversation flowing like they had been knowing each other their whole lives. She had been through her own battles, traumatic experiences, and heartbreaks that had left her guarded, but with Ryan, she felt safe. Their connection deepened. Though neither of them could quite explain it, they were living separate lives, but both tied to other people, But when they were together, nothing else seemed to matter. They shared their fears, their dreams, and their pains of their past. Latasha had never been one to let her guard down so easily. But Chris had a way of making her feel seen, understood in a way that no one else had before. For a while, they lived in their own bubble, sneaking away to the movies, spending hours walking through the parks, pretending like the outside world didn't exist. They both knew it was dangerous, but they couldn't help it. Latasha felt like she was floating, suspended in midair, and Chris felt the same. It wasn't just lust, it was something deeper, something they both had been searching for, even if they didn't realize it. But like all things, reality eventually came crashing down. Chris's wife found out about the late-night phone calls and the secret meetings. Latasha too started to feel the weight of the situation, the guilt gnawing at her. As much as they wanted to be together, they couldn't ignore the fact that their love was born in the middle of complicated lives. Chris moved out of state for a while, needing space to sort out of his emotions. He had to face the reality of his situation, of what he was doing to the people around him. During those months apart, both he and Latasha faced the hardest truth. They had fallen in love, but at what cost? Despite the distance, they kept in touch. They seen each other less, but certainly talked way more frequently. But every conversation was filled with the same deep connection they had felt from the start. Ryan spent months working through the emotional baggage of his past, preparing himself for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he and Latasha could have a future. Meanwhile, Latasha was going through her own transformation. She had always been the strong one, the one who carried others' burdens, but now she was learning to let go, to make room for herself. She knew that her love for Chris was real, but she wasn't willing to settle for being someone's secret anymore. Months turned into a year, and eventually Chris returned. He had left his marriage and was ready to start fresh, but he wasn't sure if Latasha would be there still waiting for him. The fear gnawed at him, the doubt that maybe what they had wasn't as real as he believed. But when he called her, she answered. "Hey, Chris," she said, his voice catching his throat. "Hey, Latasha." Her voice steady but soft. There was a moment of silence, the kind of silence that held the weight of everything they had been through. "I'm back," Ryan said finally, "and I'm ready if you still have me." Latasha smiled, her heart swelling with the familiar feeling of love she had tried to push aside. "I've always been here," she whispered. From that moment on, their love grew in ways neither of them could have imagined. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy. They still faced their share of challenges, but they had learned the most important lesson of all. Communication was key. Their love wasn't just built on passion or attraction. It was built on hours spent listening to each other's pain, on the shared understanding that they both had been through hell and back, but had found each other at the perfect time. Chris and Latasha survived the test of life, not because they were lucky or laboring under correct knowledge, but because they chose to fight for their love, to build it on a foundation of truth and vulnerability. They knew the world would never be perfect, but as long as they had each other, they would weather any storm. And so they danced hand in hand through life's trials, their love a beautiful symphony that had been written long before they were ever in creation. To be continued. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe.